Welcome to another episode of Legal for Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice. It's always Rosie here. And as I've said many times, this is just a group of students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology. And yes, it's regulation. And today we're talking about regulation very much so with an expert that has a lot to do with regulation and really knows all of them, basically. We are here with Giacomo Di Gregorio, my friend and producer of the podcast. Hi, Jack. See you.
Hi, Rosie.
For anyone that's actually watching the video, we actually said hi with actually waving at each other. But we are here with someone who's come on this podcast, I think 3 times. I think this is the third time. And like every time he's come, he's talked about a different regulation. So that's why I said he knows them all. Welcome on the show, Dr. Mark Leiser. Great to
Thank you
see
very
you.
much. Thank you for having me back. It's good to be back and good to see both of you again.
It's a huge pleasure to see you. And as I've said, we've always been talking about different things. So the first time you came, you talked to us about the book that you were writing, and also your production, and we discussed a bit about dark patterns, deceptive designs. We talked about the DSA, the GDPR, how they kind of intertwined. We talked about the Unfair Consumer Practices Directive and how it's not being used, and hopefully will be used soon because we then, on the second time, talks again about your book, but then we also discussed the Digital Fairness Act, which is potentially coming into force and implementing those consumer practices that we were talking about in the first time. But today we're here to, let's say, develop a whole other topic. Is it a whole other topic? We're still talking about the online world, the platform economy, but this time we're seeing it from the point of view of the Digital Markets Act. So I'm very happy to see you here today. And I'm very interested in knowing what you've been doing since we've last seen each other, because I think you've been quite busy, haven't you?
No, the exact opposite. There's been nothing going on in the world of digital technologies that's been taking up any of my time. So I was hoping the two of you would give me some ideas to work on because it's not like there's happening anything in the EU.
Sure, I think the Commission and the Parliament are actually working on that just for you. So like just wait a couple of days and I'm sure you'll find something else to research about. But you have been actually quite busy with the Commission and its doings, haven't you?
I have indeed. I mean, I think anybody that knows me for the last decade or so knows that I have some reservations about the GDPR and its effectiveness, and also the kind of instability that has been starting to creep up into the regime. And so maybe two things that I've been working on I think the digital omnibus has been erroneously labeled as a sort of battle between big tech and innovation and rights and fundamental rights and lowering or deregulation, lowering protection. I think that's wrong. I think the omnibus is about providing stability in a very widening digital acquis rulebook where lack of stability has spillover effects onto other legal regimes. So I've been doing quite a bit of work on Article 4.1 and the meaning of personal data. Um, and then the other thing that's been happening is, well, the Digital Fairness Act and trying to update consumer law in the face of digital technologies. And then over the past few weeks, there's been quite a lot about the Digital Markets Act, but one particular provision in particular, which is this thing, which is about, well, do you want me to talk about the Digital Markets Act first, or do you want me to? Well, I've
Yeah.
always kind of, yeah, I've always
Let's.
said that the Digital Services Act is about transparency obligations and giving some rules for content, and the Digital Markets Act is about platform power and regulating competition. But back to you.
Yeah, you mentioned a consultation concerning some aspects relative to the implementation of the Digital Markets Act that are yet to be clarified by the Commission. What topics do you see most pressing in this regard, and why have you decided to get involved in this matter?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, the definition of personal data is really kind of the thing that I've been focusing on over the last few months, and more broadly over a decade, really trying to develop an idea of why I think the GDPR isn't working properly. And if you think about the GDPR from a kind of very abstract point of view, well, not even really abstract, maybe the opposite of that, maybe a concrete point of view, it's about the regulation of personal data. And there's three types of data that might be important for our discussions. The first is personal data. Then the subset of that is synonymous data. And we all know that synonymous data, generally speaking, is personal data. And then anonymized data kind of falls outside of the regime. So the trigger for when the GDPR's rights and obligations actually start, that legal architecture comes down to whether the data is personal. And a more sophisticated way of considering this is what reasonable means are available to determine whether this anonymized data is personal data is actually the real legal test. That comes from the recitals of the GDPR, and it asks that you take into consideration a bunch of objective factors: time, cost, technology, technological development, state of the art, of the identifiability of data to a natural living person or a living person. So focusing on that definition or that kind of understanding about what that rules look like, then you can really understand when the GDPR is applicable and when its obligations kick in for businesses and when data subjects gets rights. The second part of that is anonymization. And anonymization, we know that some people will say that anonymization is never possible because you can always track it some back data back somehow by matching it with other data sets or looking into it to figure out who the real people are behind it. And other people will say you can, but you've got to go through all of these different kind of privacy policies and privacy sort of computer science tricks to kind of figure out how to get to privacy or get to proper anonymization. So there's a bunch of techniques that people can use. And that's why the legal test matters. So the reasonable means test that comes from recital 26 of the GDPR. Otherwise, everything would be personal data. So if you put that background to the side, the DMA has a provision. Now, the DMA is a platform power competition law regulation. And one of the things that it does is it obligates companies like Google to make their search data available to other search engines. So if you think about search and the things that you put into Google search bars, the time, the query, the person who you are, the thing you might look for, all of that is made available to help other online search engines improve their services. And you might even stretch that out a little bit to saying AI chatbots have access to that data as well to improve their models, etc. So the Digital Markets Act has a provision that says or recognizes that gatekeepers get to benefit in scale by all of the data that users give it in a way that they're locked in. People will always use Google for search, or have always, until very recently, always used Google for search. And the commission it has this measure to say, we want to get that data that people give you, and we want to give it to competitors to help them improve their services. Now, um, as you might imagine, would you two, let's you tell me your last 100 search queries that you've put in on Google. Would you be willing to do that in a public forum? Most people would not, right? Search data is very private. It can reveal lots of the most intimate details. It can reveal, like, my cancer diagnosis, my health, how, am I healthy? You can, if you're, looking up a potential partner to see if they have a history on like cyber stalking somebody, right? All of it becomes very, very sensitive, very, very quickly. So this is the challenge, right? How do we increase competitions in the marketplace by revealing search data to other competitors? And how do we then sort of make that available in a way that preserves privacy? And that's the challenge, because you want to increase competition by kind of giving people access to this data, but also do it in a way that preserves privacy. And so 611 of the DMA tackles this by giving you two kind of obligations. First, Google has to anonymize the data. And then the second thing is, and this isn't me saying this, this is the European Commission, and this is what the law says, but uh, uh, anybody that has access to the data will be bound by contract from um, using any residual insights after anonymity has taken place. So I think this is really problematic because requires anonymity, right? There shouldn't really be any residual data that you're then bounding somebody under contract law to not use or reveal. So if the law requires anonymization, then anonymization is what is required. You can't then say, oh, we're just going to do an anonymization light, reveal a few things, take out a few things. Now, if you look at the kind of guidance and what the commission put out, their version of anonymization is not GDPR anonymization. So this is why I think this is problematic, because if you go back to what I talked about earlier about the digital omnibus and the trigger logic of when the GDPR becomes active, you have this reasonable means test. And this reasonable means test in recital 26 tells us that it's an objective standard which is actor specific. So you have the same legal test, and this is my longstanding argument, is the same legal test should be applicable to every actor in the digital ecosystem, and you're going to get different results. But if people can reasonably look at search data and infer and determine very private information about you by re-identifying somebody very quickly, that's not anonymous data. That is synonymous data. And it's not falling into that umbrella of data which is outside the realm of the GDPR. So 611, although it is a competition-friendly or increasing mechanism, uh, has a legal test for anonymization, but then it says we're going to plug the holes by having anonymous light plus contract. And I think that's really problematic from a variety of points of view, not just for preserving privacy, but it creates another definition of what anonymization is. And now we have SRB identifiability. We have the absolute conceptual maximalism that some people purport to support in the GDPR and its definition of broad interpretation of Article 4.1. And then we have the competition definition of anonymization plus contract to plug those holes. And I think that's really, really dangerous at providing sort of legal certainty around the digital acquis. And I also think it creates the risk of a very dangerous precedent. Long answer to a great question.
That was a perfect overview of how Article 611 of the DMA works and how the implications of the article have an effect and an impact upon the balance of definitions, but also the balance of concepts and ultimately of data sharing that's required under European law, all of Europeans' law alike. The question that I would like to ask you, Mark, if I'm not mistaken, let's say that there are specific data practices and sampling together of data, for example, for the purpose of profiling that are obviously not allowed in the European Union. We can remember the Bundeskartellamt decision, for example, of the CJU, but also a recent decision of a Spanish court that, for example, found against Meta, saying like, you can't use you can't use the data that comes from profiling. And also the Spanish decision was that's against competition law. That's creating an unfair advantage in Meta because they're able to use specific types of data to create basically most targeted advertising outlets. And that creates an imbalance of powers between the publishers and Meta. If I'm not mistaken, that's the point. So are you somehow implying that if Article 611 is not applied carefully and in line with a kind of all-encompassing definition of anonymity, that basically big tech companies like Google or like Meta can be constrained in their ability of putting a lot of data together, but
No, no, no.
potentially,
611 is only relevant for search data, right? So
okay,
it's only
like
its
Google.
provision obligates a gatekeeper that has the search engine functionality to make that data available, search data available to other search engines. It's not a profiling data. It's not like a traditional kind of making all these
Okay,
things relevant.
let's make this clear.
It's a very specific provision, which, in my opinion, recognizes that search data is inherently sensitive. Like it's what we're querying. And one of the reasons I asked you was, would you give me your last 100 search queries? It doesn't, the
Which are
611
all shoes,
doesn't
clearly, but
apply. Yeah, doesn't apply to profiling and mixing and grouping data together as anti-competitive. That's outside of the 611 provision. But what 611 does is it recognizes that this is sensitive data, but its solution is, and I kind of forgot this part, well, I did, but I didn't use the right phrase, is that it says anonymity and then it relies on private enforcement, right? Through contract law. So uh, search engines like Google would then have to enforce against a competitor for not complying with the contractual arrangements that it made with that provider. Does that make sense? So that's effectively Google giving you the data. Google's anonymizing it light to the DMA standard put forward by DGCOM and the commission. And then Google having to enter into a contract with that provider to make sure that they don't re-identify. And if they do, Google has to then enter into an enforcement proceeding against that provider.
but
So
otherwise, like if someone uses my data in the wrong way, for example, like am I allowed to go against Google or am I allowed to go against the provider that broke the contract with Google
under
and
DMA,
we
it's not your data because they're saying it's anonymized.
okay,
So
so
yeah, so basically you would have Google Google search data anonymized light to the DMA standard of anonymization. Then that data is transferred to another online search engine, another party, and then there's a contract between Google and that third party to not re-identify. But if they did re-identify, A, how would you know? And B, the data in theory is DMA anonymized, so you wouldn't be able to exercise data subject rights because it's outside of the GDPR.
yeah, so what's the enforcement power of this provision?
Google's contract,
Um,
there is no enforcement. I mean, I maybe like I guess if they're re-identifying the you could argue that there's like you'd have to figure out that that was re-identification was taking place, but it's anonymous data or it's anonymized data, so it doesn't fall under the GDPR in theory.
at the point of Google passing it to the third
Yeah.
provider.
Yes.
But technically,
So
yes, as you said, like it could become again identifiable data. So maybe I have a claim with a third person
yeah.
then.
So the idea that you have um, a DMA standard of anonymization plus a contract binding those third parties for any residual use of that data, uh, I think is very scary. And I think in this case, it actually puts Google in a pretty bad position because if they follow the DMA standard of anonymization and they leave some things in or make some mistakes that makes re-identification possible, then then the company that has access to that data uses it or makes it easily available to re-identification in its search engine. Who do you enforce against? Do you enforce against Google, who's anonymized to the DMA standard? Well, we only anonymize to the DMA standard. Or do you enforce against this new entity who you might not necessarily have ever entered into any agreement with to process your personal data? The only thing it's done is gotten the data from Google because there's a legal obligation now on Google to pass that data to that company.
Okay, and let's say like absurd, like just let's set out a hypothesis. Let's say that um the provision in 611 is deleted out of the DMA. So in that case, would the same effect of the whole DMA with bringing more fairness and more openness to a more competitive behavior
Yeah,
between search engines and
I
not?
don't think anybody says that 611 is going to go away. The
Yeah,
consultation is not about 611 being removed, or I think even Google will say we think this is they can say we think this is a good thing, but they're not challenging the legality or the provisions that are found at 611. Where I think the consultations based around is what are the consequences for anonymization light, or should I say that DMA level of anonymization plus contract, and what will that look like in practice, as opposed to sort of getting rid of 611 altogether. So the legal obligation is that Google has to pass its search data to competitors. And the
mhm.
obligation is how do we make that all possible? How do we anonymize, and then how do we then kind of make that happen? So the question isn't about challenging 611. I want to be very clear about that. The question is how do we make anonymization plus contract work for people in a way that preserves in line and in step with the competitive objectives of the DMA?
And you do have a solution, don't you?
Well, I in my consultation submission, I think that there's a kind of hybrid method, which is um, anonymization first, and then a kind of safe access to data by certain actors that have kind of gotten into the um, approved for access, right? So if you think about the way that the DMA is operating, it's kind of anonymization plus contract, right? And what I say is that you can use a going back to the kind of using legal architecture to create a kind of hybrid approach. So you have some data, and I think we have to be honest about anonymization. Some data looks anonymous, but in reality, it can maybe reveal something. Or it's a false positive or a false negative, or it creates additional obligations that, or additional insights can make it very easily to re-identify that person. But some data for a different context might be very difficult to re-identify that person. So the challenge is how do we make all of that data apply? Now, the way I read 611 is that it's an access obligation, but it's an access right, but you can interpret it in that the commission is then bound to create an access architecture as well. And so the access architecture creates a safe space which complies with GDPR levels of access to data in that sort of competition environment in which the DMA is operating. So I call this a sort of commission specified safe search data access regime, um, which has two parts to it. The first is that I say that there needs to be um, well, there's a quandary here, right? We haven't talked about. And the quandary is, let's say you have data, right? And you anonymize it. You can anonymize it and be successful in anonymizing it, but then you strip out the utility, right? This is why it's so different for difficult for search engines and search data is that I can take all the data out, but then I remove its utility. Like I can remove all the personal identifiers, and I can have a very strong approach, but then I have removed all the utility for competitors. That's the challenge here, right? The contestability aspects of this is the real tension, right? So I could strip out personal identifiers. I can use differential privacy. I can use all these different techniques to handle the data. But then I strip out the utility for another competition or search engine that's trying to compete with Google, right? That's the key tension here. Now, what I'm saying is that you can have some things stripped away so that you preserve anonymity, but you're also able to identify that this data still has utility. So I propose two things. The first is anonymization and utility impact assessment so that you can look at whether anonymization successfully preserves utility as opposed to whether it's just anonymization so that you tackle the kind of utility aspect of the competition side of it. And at the same time, you can tackle whether or not it's suitably anonymized to preserve the data protection side of it. So there's an anonymization and utility impact assessment. That's the first part. The second part is creating the architecture so that if you find that there's going to be a suitable trade-off between or an insuitable trade-off between um, anonymization and utility, that the data should be treated a little bit differently. And if you think about licensing regimes or um, authorized actors having access to particular data, if somebody comes along and maybe is from a utility or authoritarian regime, or maybe they are a search engine coming from a jurisdiction that doesn't follow our EU values, and they want access to this data and under the auspices of increasing competition, that you might say, we we don't necessarily want to have access to you to have access to all of this personal, potentially personal or re-identifiable data. So we create a space, which is a safe search data access regime that starts from the primacy of anonymization. So you preserve this kind of daily export for lower risk common tail data where anonymization is technically defensible, and then use privacy preserving aggregates where those signals are sufficient. And then you take high risk, high value data into controlled APIs. And those controlled APIs are only accessed after the commission has validated the integrity of the people wanting to have access to that data and that they have followed certain protocols regarding its use. So you can strip certain data out, make part of that data available. You can give intermediate risk, moderate risk data under certain conditions to other actors, and you can give high risk, high value data um, independent through an API, but the access to the API is controlled by the commission. And then there's all sorts of safeguards that are built into that API access, which is kind of what we do with Article 40 of the DSA, right? We give data access to qualified entities or approved entities to have access to that. So it's something that we already do, and it's kind of borrowing the lessons of that regime and applying it to the 611 DMA obligations in that context.
You refer to LLMs being able to use this data too. How does the capability that LLMs have to infer a huge amount of information affect your solution? Would you say that your solution is AI proof?
No, no. I mean, this is the thing, right? The preliminary measures proposed by the commission, the commission takes a broad approach to AI chatbots that have online search engine functionality. So this isn't me coming up with something that's like, oh, but this will apply to chatbots. Like it's designed to apply to chatbots. It's designed to apply to OSCs, to chatbots that have that functionality. So this is why I think the actual final measures should be significantly more precise than they are in their written form. So the relevant question shouldn't be whether an AI service contains some search-like component, right? The relevant question is whether the requested data is necessary for a genuine online search engine function under 611, right? So it's not whether the LLM has an online search engine, it's whether it's necessary to make the online search engine function work properly. That's the key point. So if an AI service ends up being eligible because it provides this, it should be limited to that function and not extend to the wider service of training models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Article 611 should not serve as a route to obtain search queries, clicks, views, general purpose AI development. The final measures should separate like permitted online search engine use from prohibited non-online search engine use. And the way that the preliminary measures are set out now is that they're too broad and they're too open. And I think that needs to be narrowed.
That's that's a brilliant clarification. Um, for some of our listeners, potentially the use of APIs may not be straightforward because we all come from different areas and backgrounds. Some come from law, some come from more IT backgrounds and stuff. So um, just to clarify, of course, it's not like the commission is going to sit on a very big, large room full of doors and opening those doors
Yeah,
every time someone asks for
yeah,
access. Could you please like just quickly summarize for our listeners how an API access would work for the commission to check to verify the identity? For example, how many times the commission would have to verify the identity of a querying organization, and how that wouldn't burden the Commission to a level that, the whole of the European Union would fall because the Commission is spending time thinking
yeah.
about AVIs.
Yeah, so an API is a way that you can automate sort of program. So you automate the programming and provide an interface for mass data transfer under certain conditions. So if you go back to the old days of Twitter and its fire hose, you could get all of the tweets that people were sending with the metadata associated with that data. So rather than going on and like copying and pasting or looking and trying to manually, you get all of the data in a single, what was called a fire hose. Now, Twitter fire hose and API gives you access to the entire Twitter feed. But just like anything else, you could have access in tiers. So you'd maybe get the most recent tier of data or the 30 days past data, and you can look for trends. Or you could pay the most and you could get all of the data, historical data, to look for like massive scientific research projects, etc. Or train your LLM if that's what you wanted to do. So my idea is that if you think about all of the data has the search data that Google has under its umbrella, and that's a massive amount of search queries, right? If you think about everything that anybody ever puts into search and then the follow on. So it's not just like Mark search for something on Google. It's Mark search for something on Google and then the views that I went to in response to that search, the time and entry date of that search. You might, add other things that's part of that data feed to it. That's a lot of data. Now multiply that times every single user that uses Google search. That's huge amounts of data, historical as well. So the API idea is that that data transfer to a competitor is going to require some sort of automated interface anyway, right? I don't know the particulars of how it's going to function in reality, but when it comes to anonymized data, the commission is setting anonymization standards. So to maybe answer your question, Rosie, that I think is a little bit like, oh, the commission doesn't need to be sitting around making determinations. Well, actually, I think it does because it's got a legal framework to give other people access to the most sensitive data, right? So if you're going to be providing access to people under that umbrella, then the commission is obligated to come up with pretty stringent safeguards and a potential licensing regime and potential check marks for compliance before it hands over that anonymized data. And especially if it's going to be promoting anonymized light, DMA standards of anonymization, and then holding different contractual obligations through private enforcement for not re-identifying anybody through the residual data that's left over, then I do think that they need to be putting some safeguards in space about giving in place to be giving people, not going to have unmitigated access via an API. So what I wanted to do was create a kind of safe space for data that is controlled, that, for some levels of data that you can put like a clean room together. For other levels of data, you can, it's clearly anonymous, right? Then you can, have a tier for that data. But when you've got anonymization, and you know that some of that data is going to be false positives, false negatives, or that you know it's going to be able to re-identify in a period of time. I've heard that people have been able to re-identify search data that has been gone through the anonymization techniques in a couple of hours, right? Then when you take that into consideration with the recital 26 obligations of the GDPR about reasonable means and technical obligations and considerations and state of the art and whatnot, then you can argue that this is not only like a legal necessity, but it's also a legal obligation in the sense that you need to be doing what you say is required of all these big tech companies in the first place in the data protection sense, which is to use anonymous data where possible. The determination is reasonable means. Recital 26 tells us that. And that if you're going to be creating these kind of access points for smaller competitors to come in and build their own products through a competition lens, then you need to do it legally and responsibly as well to protect people's privacy rights.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you a like last question, but um, I know that it's really, really bad for someone that has put so much effort into coming up with a solution to think about its downsides. But if you were to assess your solution from the perspective of the commission, let's say not by looking at whether it's feasible or not, but let's look at, for example, the stakeholders that have to do with Article 611.
Mhm.
Where would you see, for example, potentially some concerns arising or some obstacles or some barriers arising? Like, who could complain about this solution in a way?
Well, the proposed architecture that I've come up with, this kind of safe data access regime, is going to take technological invention, right? It's going to take the commission sitting down and coming up with a technological solution to remedy the kind of gaps in their legal proposal. So there are the measures they're proposing. So what I say is that data sharing is if you think about data, we think about it as either being yay or nay. And what I'm saying that we should treat data sharing as a kind of family of access modalities. So we do this when there's other sensitive data settings already in place. So like the Article 40 obligations. Access can be mediated by the Commission on eligibility and purpose, documentation, secure environments, audits, confidentiality, and output controls. There's no perfect system. There's always going to be abuse in the system somewhere. But what I'm saying is, in the face of risk, you can mitigate it, and that it's never going to be perfect. And I don't think that we expect or should expect that a system for safe data access should be viewed, or you run the risk of it being viewed as a perfect solution. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this is an obligation because there's significant risk relative to the search data that users will be transferring to a third party. And that's just simply it. And so there should be a kind of, if we operate on the basis of risk regulation, then the likelihood of re-identification is real, especially under the DMA form of anonymization, that you have a legal obligation to come up with a mitigation to that risk. So the risk for me is that contestability value is the kind of clear parameter, and that we shouldn't be viewing parity between anonymization and contractual arrangements as being something that we should be subscribing to. The other side of that is we create a false narrative that anything that we put forward is 100% foolproof solution. There's a lot of moving parts that have to work properly, but what we're doing is we're trying to come up with a framework to mitigate that risk. And uh, for me, this is the best I can come up with in the very short amount of time the commission gave us to provide. It was literally a couple of week window to provide feedback on the consultation, of which I must point out, most places around Belgium and the Netherlands have a very awkward week this week because there's King Days and bank holidays and things like that. So there's not a lot of wiggle room here to get feedback on your ideas and talk through everything. Maybe that was by design, who knows? But I do feel a little bit frustrated at the lack of time to be able to get some traditional feedback from other people and to put it into practice.
I mean, I'm sure that the guys in Silicon Valley never sleep, right? No, I'm joking, of course
Yeah.
not. And yes, potentially the commission realized that there was a big issue with the enforcement of this kind of provision and maybe try to make amends quickly. And
Yeah.
thanks God that there are people like you who read the commission's calls for action, because I would say sometimes they're also hidden on the website,
Yeah.
which is like, where is it now? Um, Mark, before we let you go, a couple of information that I think you probably have to share with our listeners, which one is, well, like, what do you suggest them to read about this topic and other topics that we've discussed in the past? I'm sure that they will remember all the podcasts that we recorded with you, and will probably be looking forward to the next time that you'll come on the pod, so I can buy another pair of shoes, as discussed at the beginning of this conversation.
Yeah.
And
So
yeah,
let me answer that question first because that's going
yep.
to be relatively easy for me to address. The first is in my spirit of open knowledge sharing and whatnot. I will put my consultation submission open access, so I'll make it available via LinkedIn, and as a consequence of that, I'll try to explain the problem and my approach in several Substack posts. So follow me on LinkedIn. I'm sure the podcast will provide my profile address, and I'll give you a link to my submission so you can make the submission available. There's a few other people that are posting about 611. So if you want to go look for it, you can find it. And I think over the course of the next few weeks or so, my approach, I think, is to try and combine my ideas and consultation submissions with an online lecture. So I'm going to do an online lecture in which I use these submissions and the knowledge that I have about what's happening with 611 to create a kind of lecture experience where I use slides and recording. And I'll upload those to YouTube so people can access for free. And obviously, I'm sure I'll be able to count on your support, reposting those posts to get that to a wider audience that I'm sure you already have.
Yep, so all of our listeners will find everything in the show notes. I saw Jack getting the notes down because he's the person behind all the show notes, just saying. Um, no,
Sorry,
and
Jack, more work for you.
Now I'm in trouble now.
also because Mark will go and check. So it's a vicious cycle. And then, like, before we really, really, really let you go, Mark, how are your books going? I think is
Yeah,
there
so
some news for us?
well, the Dark Patterns book has been out for a while. It certainly seems to have landed with people, and a lot of encouraging feedback on that. My second book, I have delivered the manuscript to the publishers. I have gone through the proofreading and typesetting process, if you want to call it that. We've agreed to the book cover and all the stuff that's going to appear on the outside. And I think it is going to come out in August, September. That's my release date. So very excited about both of those. And then I promise you, Rosie, I'm going to take a break
Oh,
from
finally. I
writing
mean,
books, from writing
you're
books
gonna
anyway.
take the best break for, like, the best time for a break is autumn. So, like, it's definitely
Yeah,
well, yeah. No, I'm really happy, and I will be looking forward to reading the book as well.
thank you very much.
So yeah, that was, I think, everything from the Legal for Tech, the podcast. Thank you, Mark Leiser, and of course, thank you, Jack, for joining us and helping us so much.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DG Beetle. DG Beetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.